The throne hall of the Dragon Empire stretched higher than any human eye could follow. Its walls were carved from dark crystal, shining with a faint, golden light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. Every surface reflected the grandeur of a civilization older than many planets. The floor was polished so perfectly that the dragons could see the reflections of their claws as they stood in formation. The air smelled faintly of smoke and incense, mixed with the sharp tang of metal from the armor and weapons of the guards. Silence hung over the hall, so complete it pressed on the chests of everyone present. Rows of noble dragons sat on elevated platforms, their scales shimmering in red, blue, and silver. Each scale seemed polished, each movement precise. These were dragons born to rule, trained in politics, warfare, and the history of the stars. Between them, representatives from distant planets stood in awe. Alien beings with delicate wings, thin tentacles, or glimmering skin watched carefully, hoping to witness the heir's ceremonial entrance. The hall was a mixture of excitement and fear. Any mistake by the heir could be taken as a sign of weakness across the empire. Any small misstep could ripple across the galaxy like a storm. At the far end of the hall, the massive doors that led to the throne were closed, their edges decorated with intricate carvings of dragons in flight. Guards stood rigidly on either side, their eyes scanning the crowd. They were tall and strong, their claws polished to a sharp sheen, and their expressions unreadable. Even among dragons they were known as disciplined and loyal. Today they were more than soldiers, they were symbols of order, ensuring that nothing would disrupt the sacred moment when the heir would step forward. The heir was expected to appear at exactly the right time, walking down the hall with measured grace. The story of this heir was whispered across the empire. Even humans on distant planets knew of him. He was the only child of the Dragon Emperor, trained from birth to rule. He was cold, precise, and distant. He never smiled in public, never made unnecessary gestures, and rarely spoke unless it concerned imperial matters. The galaxy had long assumed that he would be a ruler who relied on power, fear, and strength. But no one truly knew him, not even the nobles in the hall. Among the human envoys and servants, there was a quiet presence. A janitor, a man with worn clothes and tired eyes, moved carefully among the rows of polished platforms, carrying a bucket and mop. He was not allowed near the nobles or the ceremonial areas, but duty had brought him here. His work was to make sure the hall was clean and safe for the event, and he had been doing this job for many years. No one paid him attention. To the dragons, humans were strange and fragile, incapable of understanding the weight of empire. To the janitor, dragons were magnificent and terrifying, but he had learned to respect them from afar. The clockwork bells began to chime, signaling that the heir would soon appear. Every eye turned to the throne doors. The humans took a step back. The nobles straightened their spines, claws gripping the edges of their seats. A heavy tension filled the hall, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then the doors began to move, slow and deliberate. The hinges squealed slightly, echoing through the silence like a small warning. All at once the heir appeared. He did not run. He did not rush. His long robes shimmered like molten silver as he walked. His eyes, sharp and golden, scanned the hall briefly. Every movement was controlled, measured, perfect. He was taller than most dragons of his age, his wings folded neatly against his back. The crowd collectively held its breath. This was the moment they had waited for. But then something happened that no one expected. Instead of walking straight toward the throne, the heir's eyes flicked to the side. Across the hall, near the base of one of the platforms, the janitor was quietly mopping. The man's face was tired but calm. He did not notice the heir at first. But the heir stopped. For a heartbeat he simply stared. His expression softened in a way the galaxy had never seen. The nobles stiffened. Murmurs spread like a quiet whine through the platforms. Whispers of confusion, shock, and disbelief filled the air. The ceremonial entrance was not supposed to be interrupted. Every eye turned toward the heir. Every scale seemed to ripple with anticipation and fear. Then, without warning, the heir stepped off the perfect path. He walked past the throne. He ignored the guards who opened their jaws in surprise. He ignored the council members who were frozen in shock. He walked straight to the human janitor. The janitor froze. His mop slipped slightly, water spilling across the polished floor. The heir stopped in front of him. For a moment, the janitor did not understand what was happening. Then the heir leaned forward and wrapped his arms around the man, hugging him tightly. The sound of the crowd gasping echoed like thunder. Dragons whispered in disbelief. Aliens blinked, unsure of whether to intervene. The heir held him. The hug lasted longer than anyone expected. In that moment, the cold, distant air became something no one had ever seen. Vulnerable, human-like in emotion, and completely unafraid. The janitor's eyes widened, but he did not push the air away. Instead, he gently rested his hands on the air's back, unsure, amazed, and touched. The emperor rose from his throne, massive wings folding out like sails. His voice rumbled, deep and commanding, "What is the meaning of this?" The hall was silent except for the soft sound of the air's breathing and the janitor's quiet, surprised shuffle. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the guards were frozen, unsure whether to step forward or wait. The air finally released the janitor and stepped back, his expression steady again but softer than before. He looked up at the emperor and spoke, his voice clear and unwavering, "I remember who saved me." The hall was stunned. Every dragon, every envoy, every being present understood that this was not a ceremonial act. This was personal. This was history being rewritten in front of their eyes. The galaxy had expected obedience, formality, and distance. Instead, they saw courage, memory, and compassion. And in that moment, no one could predict what would come next. The hall trembled with whispers, gasps, and the quiet rustling of wings. Officials and nobles were frozen, unsure what to do. Some leaned forward, trying to hear what the heir would say next. Some looked at each other with disbelief. The young heir, the one trained for years to be untouchable, stood still in front of the human janitor. He did not speak for a long moment. He simply stared at the man he had run to hug. The room held its breath, as if waiting for some great disaster to fall. Then, in a voice both soft and firm, the heir said, "You saved me." The hall fell into a deeper silence. No one moved. The emperor's massive eyes narrowed, trying to understand what the heir meant. Saved him? How could a human janitor, so small, so ordinary, have done anything to help the future ruler of the Dragon Empire? Some nobles whispered accusations, calling the story impossible. They could not imagine that a lowly human had influenced the heir in any way. The heir's eyes softened, and he took a slow step back from the janitor, allowing the memory to unfold. He did not shout. He did not demand recognition. He simply began to show them the truth through his words and expressions. Years ago, long before his identity was revealed to the galaxy, he had been just a child. Not yet a prince in the eyes of the Empire, not yet trained to command respect or fear. He had wandered the endless corridors of the palace, lost and frightened. The grand halls, the endless polished floors, and the towering doors that now filled the throne hall with majesty had been nothing but a maze to him back then. He had been small, alone, and very scared. Every shadow seemed like it could swallow him whole. Every sound echoed like a warning. The guards had passed him by. They saw a small child alone, but they did not stop. They feared punishment if they interacted with someone who was not supposed to be in the corridors. They did not know who he was, and they were too cautious to act. The nobles, busy with ceremonies and lessons, had also not noticed him. They were distant, occupied with matters of politics and appearances. The child had been invisible to the people who filled the palace with power and authority. And then the janitor appeared. He was carrying a bucket and mop, moving quietly down the corridor. His steps were careful, his face calm and kind. He noticed the small child, shivering and confused, and did not recoil. He did not ask who the child was. He did not call for guards. Instead, he knelt down, far lower than the child's eyes, and spoke softly. His voice was calm, steady, and full of warmth. "Are you lost?" he asked. The child had not expected kindness. He had expected commands, orders, maybe even a scolding. But here was a human, ordinary in every way, treating him as if he mattered simply because he was there. The janitor offered him water in a small cup, and a piece of bread, wrapped carefully in cloth. He took off his gloves and held out his hand, guiding the child gently away from the cold, empty corridors. The child's small heart had filled with fear and relief at the same time. For the first time in weeks he felt safe. He felt understood. The janitor did not ask him to be brave, did not demand he act like a prince or a dragon. He simply treated him as a being who needed help. And that simple act left a mark. The child remembered the kindness, the calm in the human's eyes, the way the janitor did not rush, did not panic, and did not care about status. He had only cared about him. Back in the throne hall, the heir's gaze met the janitor's again. "You were there when no one else was," he said, voice steady but soft. "When I was small and lost, you saw me. You helped me when everyone else ignored me. I have never forgotten that." The janitor looked around at the sea of noble eyes, their scales glittering in disbelief. He shook his head slightly, almost embarrassed. "I did nothing," he said quietly. "I just helped a child." But the heir shook his head. It was everything. The nobles began to murmur more loudly. A human affected the heir? One hissed to another. How could someone so ordinary change the future of the empire? Another whispered, this is madness. This is not proper. The heir should follow tradition, not memory. The child who had grown into the heir remembered every detail. The long corridors, the echo of his small footsteps, the cold stone floors, the dim lights that flickered above. And he remembered the janitor's gentle hand, the way the man guided him through the maze without ever asking for thanks or recognition. It was the first time he had felt someone truly care about him, not for his title, not for what he would become, but simply for who he was in that moment. Do you remember? The heir asked softly, looking at the janitor with golden eyes that reflected years of memory. You led me safely back to the main halls. You told me it would be okay. You never asked me to call you friend, never asked me to remember your name. But I did. I have remembered. The janitor's lips pressed together. He did not respond at first. There were tears in his eyes, though he tried to hide them. I only did what I thought was right, he said. That is why I ran to you today, the heir said. Not because I am heir, not because of ceremony or law, but because you reminded me that goodness is stronger than fear, that care is stronger than power, and that every life, human or dragon, matters. Across the hall, officials shifted nervously. The emperor's massive form towered above them, silent, absorbing every word. This was no simple act of rebellion, no random mistake by the heir. This was something else entirely, a memory of compassion that had shaped the person who would one day rule the empire. For the first time, those who watched realized that the young heir was not just cold, distant, and trained for command. He was human in ways that no one expected, shaped not by power or fear, but by a simple act of kindness from someone the galaxy would never have expected to matter. The hall waited, tense and uncertain, for what would come next. No one had ever seen anything like this. The heir and the janitor stood together, a child's memory and a quiet life converging in the center of the Dragon Empire. And in that moment, everyone present understood that the galaxy had changed in ways no law, no weapon, and no throne could ever accomplish. The tension in the throne hall thickened like smoke. The Dragon Council had gathered in full, their wings folding and unfolding nervously. The eldest counselor, a silver-scaled dragon with eyes sharp as daggers, rose and rumbled, "Explain this immediately. Why is a human in the sacred halls? Why has the heir broken ceremony to hug him?" Other council members murmured in agreement. Their voices were a low hum vibrating through the crystal floors. Some leaned forward, claws tapping impatiently. Their scales glimmered in anger, disbelief, and worry. Humans had never been allowed this close. Even in diplomacy, humans were kept distant, treated politely but carefully. To see one in the center of the throne hall, touching the future ruler, was nothing short of scandalous. The janitor, standing quietly near the heir, shifted uneasily. He had expected the nobles and counselors to be wary, but not this level of suspicion. They looked at him as if he had broken sacred law or worse, threatened the empire itself. I was only doing my work," he said softly. "I clean the halls. I keep things in order." The counselors hissed in frustration. "This is more than work," one growled. "You have interfered with the heir's training, his discipline, his duty. You may have manipulated him. How can we know what you have whispered into his mind?" The heir stepped forward. He raised his head, golden eyes steady and unwavering. "He did not manipulate me," he said clearly. "He saved me. When I was a child, lost in the corridors, frightened and alone, he offered help. He did not demand recognition. He did not ask for power. He only cared." The council scoffed. "Cared?" Another hissed. "You are heir to the Dragon Emperor. You are expected to follow tradition, not memories of kindness." The heir's wings lifted slightly, a subtle display of authority. "Tradition is not always right," he said. "I am not here to punish him. I am here to show that worth is not measured by rank or status. He saved me when no one else would. That act, simple as it may seem, is stronger than fear, stronger than authority, and more important than ceremony." The council leaned forward. Their voices rose, but the heir did not falter. Some of the younger counselors whispered quietly to one another. They remembered the stories of the heir's childhood, tales told by palace servants. They recalled how a small child, unnoticed and ignored, had once wandered the palace alone. None had thought it important at the time. Now it seemed that memory had shaped him entirely. The emperor's deep voice cut through the murmurs, slow and commanding. "He has a point," he said. His wings stretched wide, casting shadows across the hall. This human did not act for personal gain. He did not seek influence. He acted out of care. That is the kind of courage that cannot be taught in training halls. That is the kind of strength we need in the Empire. The council gasped. Some hissed in anger, others blinked in disbelief. Many struggled to accept that a human, weak, fragile by dragon standards, could be honored in the halls of the Empire. One counselor, old and sharp, said, "This is dangerous precedent. Today it is one human. Tomorrow it could be many. What will stop them from influencing the heir, shaping the Empire?" The heir shook his head gently. "Only actions matter, not intentions alone. He never sought to influence me. He only acted with care. That is what I remember. That is why I came to him today." The janitor's eyes were wide. He had never imagined that his quiet act of kindness would become a matter of empire-wide discussion. He had only done what seemed right at the time. Now he stood in the center of a room filled with dragons, some angry, some curious, all watching. The weight of their attention was heavy, but he did not flinch. He looked at the heir, and in that glance, both understood what mattered more than ceremony or law: courage to do what is right even when unnoticed. The emperor rose from his throne. His claws pressed firmly on the steps, his voice echoing like distant thunder. "We will examine this carefully. But let it be known, the Empire is not strengthened by fear alone. Compassion has its place. Strength without care is hollow." Whispers spread again, this time with hesitation. Some counselors began to nod slightly, unsure but curious. Others remained stiff, eyes narrow, wings folded in judgment. The tension had not disappeared, but a small seed of understanding had been planted. The heir stepped closer to the janitor. "You do not need reward," he said softly. "Your actions will be remembered. That is enough." The janitor shook his head. "I only did what seemed right," he said. The heir smiled faintly, a rare expression that softened his usually cold features. "That is why it mattered. Because it was done without expectation. Because it was simple and true and human." Some of the counselors began to murmur quietly among themselves. They were surprised to realize that a small, ordinary human had shown something more valuable than any display of dragon power. A lesson, unexpected and unplanned, had entered the halls of the Empire. The crowd of envoys, witnesses from other planets, leaned forward. They had come to see ceremony, politics, and protocol. Instead, they saw courage, memory, and the quiet power of kindness. They watched the janitor, the heir, and the emperor, and slowly, they understood a truth they had not expected. That influence is not always loud, that strength is not always visible, and that humans, fragile and ordinary as they seemed, carried a quiet force that could shape the future. The counselors, still uneasy, finally fell silent. The heir had spoken. The emperor had agreed. The message had been sent. Sometimes the smallest acts carry the greatest power. And for the first time, the janitor realized that his quiet, unnoticed years of service had changed something far larger than he could ever have imagined. The hall remained still, but the air had shifted. The council may have doubted, the nobles may have been shocked, but the idea had been planted. Humans were capable of more than the dragons had ever expected. Compassion, memory, and courage mattered as much as claws, wings, or fire. And in that silence, the future of the Empire began to feel a little different. Less rigid, less cold, and more open to the quiet, unexpected lessons that a human could bring. The throne hall had not been this quiet in generations. The dragons, nobles, and envoys waited, uncertain what would come next. Eyes turned to the emperor, whose massive form seemed even larger than usual, his wings folding slowly behind him. The silence stretched long, broken only by the soft tapping of claws on polished floors. Every gaze followed him as he moved forward, each step heavy with authority and history. Finally, the emperor's deep voice filled the hall, rumbling like distant thunder. "This moment changes more than ceremony. It changes what we know about courage, care, and strength." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "This human," he said, nodding toward the janitor, "does not hold power by title or by dragon blood. Yet he has shown the greatest of virtues: compassion when no one watched, courage without expectation, and wisdom in his simplicity." The hall gasped. Many dragons had never heard the emperor speak in such a way, acknowledging a human as an example. Some council members stiffened, unable to hide their disbelief. Others leaned forward, curious, trying to understand what the emperor truly meant. "I order," the emperor continued, voice steady, "that this human be honored. Not with rank, not with titles, but with recognition. Let all in the empire know that worth is not measured by status, but by action. A murmur spread across the hall. Humans had never been recognized this way. They were usually servants, diplomats, or workers always kept at a distance. To be publicly thanked by the emperor himself was unthinkable. The janitor, standing quietly, shifted slightly, unsure what to do. His hands trembled and he pressed them together. He had never imagined such attention. He had only done what seemed right when a small child had been lost in palace corridors years ago. The heir stepped forward, standing beside the janitor. He did not act for reward, the heir said. He did not seek fame or position. He acted because it was the right thing to do. That is why it matters more than any law, more than any throne. The emperor nodded at the heir. He speaks the truth. The galaxy must see that kindness is not weakness. Compassion is not failure. And humans, though small and fragile compared to dragons, can teach us lessons we cannot learn on our own. The counselors exchanged looks. Some stiffened in disbelief, still struggling with the idea. Others slowly nodded. The emperor raised his claws again, commanding silence. To ensure that this lesson is not forgotten, new policies will be proposed. Humans will be allowed closer roles and shared systems. They will not be servants or slaves, but trusted caretakers, mediators, and advisors where wisdom and care are needed. The murmurs quieted. Some counselors whispered cautiously to one another. They remembered the years of fear and hierarchy that had defined the empire. Humans had always been seen as small, limited, and fragile. The idea that humans could now have influence, even small official roles, seemed shocking. Yet, hearing the emperor's voice and seeing the heir's resolve made the idea harder to dismiss. The janitor blinked, overwhelmed. Recognition was one thing, but influence? He had never wanted it. He had only done what he thought was right. He pressed his lips together, unsure how to respond. The heir smiled faintly, a rare expression of warmth and gratitude. "It is not for you to act differently," he said softly. "It is for the galaxy to see that good can be quiet and still powerful." Outside the hall, envoys from distant planets murmured among themselves. They had traveled to witness ceremony and tradition, expecting pomp and displays of power. Instead, they had seen courage, memory, and the quiet strength of a human being recognized by dragons. Some of them whispered to each other, exchanging surprised glances. Perhaps humans were more capable than they had ever believed. Perhaps even the most fragile life could shape the course of empires. Back in the hall, the emperor turned to the council. "This will not be immediate. Change must be gradual or it risks chaos. But let it begin. Let it start with acknowledgement and fairness. Let humans see that their actions matter. Let dragons see that care is not weakness. And let all know that even the smallest act of courage can ripple across the galaxy." The counselors nodded reluctantly. They still felt unease, but the emperor's decision was final. The laws would be written. Policies would be adjusted. The empire's understanding of worth, strength, and influence would change. The janitor lowered his head slightly, humbled. He had never sought recognition, never dreamed of affecting empire-wide policy. Yet here he was, standing in the center of a hall that had once ignored him, now the subject of gratitude and admiration. The heir placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "You have reminded us all what matters," the heir said. "And that is more than any ceremony, any throne, or any crown." The emperor's eyes swept over the hall. "Let the record show," he said, voice resonating like stone, "that the galaxy will remember this moment. Not for titles, not for power, but for simple acts that reveal the strength within us. Today humans are recognized not for what they are, but for what they teach us about being better." The hall was still for a moment, absorbing the weight of the declaration. Then whispers began, softer now, more reflective. Some dragons nodded to each other quietly. Some humans who had been observing from a distance felt a spark of hope. Perhaps they could participate, help, and influence the empire in ways that had seemed impossible. The heir and the janitor stood together at the center. The janitor glanced around, finally allowing himself a small smile. "I only did what I could," he said softly. "And that was enough," the heir replied. The emperor settled back onto his throne, satisfied. The galaxy had seen a small, quiet act of courage, now honored and acknowledged. It would not erase the history of dragons or humans, nor would it immediately change centuries of tradition. But it planted a seed of respect, fairness, and understanding, that could grow stronger with time. And in that moment, the empire understood a truth it had not expected, that power is not only in claws, fire, or titles. It is in compassion. It is in courage without expectation. And it is sometimes found in the smallest, quietest of lives. Years passed. The Dragon Empire continued to grow, its vast cities reaching higher into the sky, its fleets of starships patrolling distant worlds. Yet the moment in the throne hall, the day the heir ran past the throne to hug a human janitor, was never forgotten. Historians wrote of it carefully, not as a scandal or rebellion, but as a turning point in the history of the galaxy. They noted that the empire did not change because of war, because of rebellion, or because of fear. It changed because a child remembered kindness. In classrooms, young dragons were taught the story not as a lesson in obedience or power, but as a lesson in humanity. Teachers spoke of the janitor, a simple man who had never sought fame or reward, and the heir who remembered a moment of care and let it shape his rule. Even the smallest act of kindness, the instructors said, can change the course of the galaxy. Students listened with wide eyes, imagining the vast halls and the golden-eyed heir who ran past every expectation to embrace someone who had helped him when no one else would. The janitor lived a quiet life, returning to his work in the palace and maintaining the halls he had always cared for. He never sought recognition, and yet recognition found him. He was invited to observe councils, speak quietly to leaders, and share his thoughts when asked. Dragons listened to him, not as a ruler, not as a noble, but as a trusted voice who had shown that simple acts of care could matter more than the greatest displays of power. The heir grew into his role as emperor, but he never forgot. He ruled not only with strategy and wisdom but with the memory of that small, brave human who had seen him when he was invisible. When disputes arose, he remembered how understanding, patience, and attention could resolve matters without fear. When his people faltered, he remembered that care and courage often mattered more than orders. Across the empire, dragons began to act differently. They treated humans and one another with more attention, more respect, and more understanding. The galaxy noticed the change. Historians later wrote about the ripple effect. They said the empire's policies toward humans were no longer based on hierarchy or fear. Humans were allowed to take on important roles as caretakers, mediators, and advisors. They were not rulers, but they had influence. They helped guide the empire in ways the dragons could not. And the dragons learned that influence is not always found in power or bloodlines. It is sometimes found in the quiet decisions of those who do not seek glory. The emperor's actions were praised in records across the stars. Some wrote poetry about the day the heir hugged the janitor. Some wrote songs that were sung quietly in households, not for entertainment, but as reminders of the strength of small acts. Children, both human and dragon, were taught to notice acts of care around them. They were taught that the greatest leaders remembered kindness, and that the most powerful moments were sometimes invisible to those who only looked for power. The janitor occasionally returned to the old halls where he had first met the heir. He walked slowly along the polished floors, observing the high ceilings and the intricate carvings, remembering the fear and loneliness of the small child he had once helped. He smiled quietly to himself. No one noticed him much anymore, and he liked it that way. He did not need attention. He did not need glory. He only needed to know that his actions had mattered. And he could see it everywhere, in the policies, in the behavior of dragons, and in the calm, just, and thoughtful rule of the emperor. The emperor often visited him in those quiet moments, not in ceremony or parade but in private. They would walk through the halls, the heir sometimes asking questions about humans and their ways, the janitor answering softly, simply, and honestly. They spoke of courage, kindness, fairness, and memory. And in those moments, the heir remembered the lesson that had shaped him, while the janitor quietly witnessed the galaxy being changed in ways he had never imagined. Over time, even distant planets came to know the story. Envoys from alien worlds would speak of it, and humans across the stars would tell their children of the janitor who had never sought recognition, and the heir who remembered him. The tale became a quiet legend, not of war or conquest, but of trust, memory, and the quiet power of human compassion. The galaxy, historians wrote, learned an important truth. Leadership is not only about strength, weapons, or strategy. Leadership is about seeing others, remembering kindness, and acting with courage when it matters most. The Dragon Empire had grown larger, stronger, and wiser, not because it had crushed enemies, but because one human had acted with care, and one child had never forgotten it. Even centuries later, the story continued to be told. Dragons and humans, nobles and workers, all remembered that the galaxy's greatest moments often began quietly. They remembered that a janitor's simple act of helping a lost child had reshaped the empire's understanding of value, power, and leadership. And across the stars, a new standard emerged, that no act of care is ever too small to matter, and no life is too ordinary to leave a mark on the galaxy. In the end, the emperor's rule was remembered not for battles won or systems conquered, but for the compassion he carried in his heart. And the janitor, who had done nothing but act rightly when it mattered, was remembered as the quiet force behind the change, the small light that had shown the galaxy how humans could teach even dragons the true meaning of courage. And so, the story ended where it had begun, with a child remembering kindness, a human acting without expectation, and a galaxy learning that true power is measured not in fire or fear, but in care, courage, and quiet responsibility.